Today is the great articulation of what it means to be a Christian. Jesus is asked in Matthew's Gospel, although it's also in Mark and Luke's, which commandment of the law is the greatest? And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all with your mind, and that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with everything that you are. Love neighbor as self. All the versions essentially point to the fact that loving God with all that one is and loving all others as you would love yourself is by far the most important thing for a Christian to live by. Now, what comes into conflict is who is asking the question and what is their motivation. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all differ on this, and that should tell us two things. One, it tells us that each of the gospel writers had some agenda in putting their gospels together. They were each using things that Jesus said to articulate more, articulate their understanding. And so it's important to see this and to understand this, but not to simply say it happened this way and only this way. Matthew, in my mind, is the least fortunate way of it happening, because his context for asking the questions, when the Pharisee heard that they had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. In other words, they are seeking to entrap Jesus. And so there is no connection between Jesus' answer and the way that they, as Jews, are to live their life. And that is counter to the way Mark frames the story. Mark has a scribe asking the question of Jesus in the midst of the conflict between Jesus and the temple leaders. And Jesus' response is welcomed by the scribes. He says, yes, this is exactly what is important. This is what it means to be a faithful follower of God. And that is so important for those who are Christians to understand that in its essence, Jesus was first and foremost the faithful Jew. His articulation of faith, of trust and love of God, and neighbor as self is first and foremost what it means to be achieved by the law and covenant that God had with God's people. Now, I do want to focus for just a second on Luke's version of the story, because like Matthew, he has a lawyer, but the lawyer isn't necessarily one of the temple leaders. And he asks the question of Jesus, and Jesus gives the response. And then we are told this in Luke's gospel. Wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Because I think the conflict happens is the way one defines neighbor. Is neighbor someone who lives near you? Is neighbor part of your tribe? Is neighbor part of your religion? Is neighbor people you agree with? And in this context of Luke's gospel, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan and the surprising moment when the person who helps, the person who is the neighbor, isn't a faithful Jew, isn't one of the leaders that is dedicated to caring for the people, but instead is the hated Samaritan. Jesus makes it clear that as a Jew, which Jesus is, the important understanding of neighbor is that neighbor is everyone. everyone who acts and cares for one another. It doesn't matter what group you belong to. It doesn't matter what you believe. You are neighbor to someone when you care for them. That's what it means to love neighbor as self. Luke's stunning story throws light on our way to understand what it means to love God and neighbor as self. Thanks be to God for that.